You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Thursday, April 4th. It is also the feast day of Saint Isidore. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are continuing to journey with Christ through Lent. We are talking particularly about the parables he told and used to teach while he was here on earth. We've already discussed that a parable is a Jewish style of storytelling. It uses elements from ordinary life, but oftentimes has something strange in there that should make us question and should lead us into a deeper understanding of what Jesus is talking about, particularly an understanding about God the Father and how we are called to follow. We have already talked about the parables of the lost sheep, the unmerciful servant, and yesterday we talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Today, we are going to be talking about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. This parable appears in a couple of different Gospels, but we are reading the version from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus then addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. Now, this is a short little parable, and perhaps we're used to Jesus giving harsh critiques to the Pharisees, but the people at the time were not so used to that. So just to remind you, a Pharisee was a person of prestige in the Jewish faith. They knew their faith, they practiced their faith, they oftentimes taught their faith. In fact, the high priest belonged to the group of Pharisees, and the Pharisees were respected in the Jewish community. We hear here, however, about a Pharisee that is not living very well, and that is what is strange or even shocking to the people that heard this story. A tax collector at the time was seen as someone that was very sinful, that worked for Rome, that was greedy and corrupt. And the idea that a tax collector's prayer would be heard by God over the prayer of a Pharisee would have been quite shocking for those that heard this story. But Jesus is making a very powerful point. We do not need to exalt ourselves. It is God's place to exalt us, not our own. When we give in to pride, even pride about the way that we are living our spiritual life, it is offensive to God. Instead, He wants us to embrace humility and to use the prayer that the tax collector uses. The tax collector says, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner," because we are all sinners. Even though the Pharisee lived an outwardly good life, he tells us that he fasts regularly, that he pays tithes. He probably practiced all the pinnacles of the Jewish faith. He still had one terrible sin. He was prideful. He didn't do these things necessarily out of love for God, but probably so that others would see what he was doing and admire him. And this is offensive to God. Instead, God loves the humility of the tax collector, that the tax collector comes to God, throws himself at God's feet, and says, "You alone can save me. Have mercy on me." And so, Sprouts, I have a small challenge for you today. Once again, I ask you to say this prayer as you think about this parable. Think about how you can be like the tax collector. Come before God humbly, seeking his mercy and love. And say this prayer: Jesus, teach me humility.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. Just one more thing, Sprouts. I need your help. Following Easter, we are going to be having a special series here on the Catholic Sprouts podcast where we talk directly to people that have made the choice to enter religious life, specifically those that serve our church as priests or those that have become nuns. So, what I need from you are questions. If you could ask a priest or a nun anything, what would you ask them? Talk to your adult and have them submit your questions that I will use to talk to priests and nuns and share with you here on the podcast. So submit them at catholicsprouts.com/questions.